Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to take a closer look at Act 1, which, as a quick review, involves 3 checkpoints: the hook, backstory, and trigger. So let's dive right in with the hook. So to begin with, this moment, you want to grab some attention, and you want to establish at least one story question.
So a story question would be anything that causes the reader to read on in order to find the answer. And it could be something as simple as what is going on, who is my protagonist, or it could be something more complex, like what happened in the back story to make these things the way that they are, what historical event shaped the character, shaped the world. Or it could be about the world itself, especially if it's fantasy, dystopian, alternate universe. Then it could be, what kind of a world is this place? In a mystery, the story question is often the mystery itself. If someone has died or disappeared, or the events surrounding the current situation are unknown to the players themselves, then that could form the heart of a mystery that would be the story question. And sometimes the story question might not be answered for a very long time. It might be the climax of the book or even the ending of the book where the story question is answered. Other times we can pitch story questions out and answer them 2 pages later on, but have started another one in the meantime, and by constantly overlapping story questions, we can lead the reader on to the next one.
Essentially, story questions are a way of keeping your reader engaged and interested, wanting to know more, so that they keep turning pages.
Right.
So the other advice that we have to offer about the hook is that you want to begin with action or dialogue. Pages and pages of dense prose is not usually a very engaging way to get somebody's attention, and also starting with a dream is now seen as fairly cliched. I am sure that it could still be done with a fresh take, but most of the time it's better to start immediately and let your readers know exactly where you are and what's going on.
But that's not to say that they have to understand what's going on. You can be right in the middle of some action. You can be right in the middle of some dialogue, and readers will become attentive and start paying closer attention to try to figure out what's going on.
I guess my point is, what you want to avoid is the "and then I woke up,"
right,
and realize that the milieu that you just set is not, in fact, actually the world in which your protagonist is inhabiting.
Right, exactly.
Let's see. So, also, it's usually good to begin with your protagonist. Otherwise, you risk the reader bonding with the wrong character. If you get very attached to somebody and think, oh, this is a really interesting person, I can't wait to read a whole book about them, only to discover that their only role was in the first several pages, can be a frustrating experience.
Yes, and aside from the issue of bonding with the wrong character, there's the issue of bonding with no one. It used to be stylish to start a book with a long description of the setting, but readers will just skip over all of that or put the book down now if you try to do that. Another aspect of starting with the protagonist is to not start with a prologue. Editors absolutely hate prologues, and frankly a prologue is usually an attempt to fix something that is wrong dramatically with the book, because a prologue is really trying to tell your readers some context that you feel that they need, but either the protagonist knows it or the protagonist doesn't know it. If the protagonist knows it, then there are ways to draw it out as you tell the story. The protagonist can talk about it with somebody, the protagonist can remember it, or you can simply pick it up from context. And if the protagonist doesn't know it, well then really the reader doesn't need to know it either. If the protagonist is baffled by the situation or doesn't understand what historical event 200 years before caused this to happen, that's all right. Let the readers be equally baffled.
If it's important, you'll explain it later.
That's right.
And then finally, the tip with the hook is to choose as late as possible a moment to begin your story. You really want to start them right in the middle of the action, at the last possible second.
And this really relates to the overall story structure, the context of the overall story. I have a lot of students who approach me and they say, oh, I've got this idea for the story of this girl, and she was born and then she lived for all of these different years and then these things happened to her. And that's really not the way that you want to tell the story. There's some life-changing moment that forms the core of every story. Stories are about that life-changing moment. They're about the protagonist's emotional journey of change. The culmination of that is, as we saw in the previous lecture, is that epiphany that occurs at the end of Act 2 when they really change. And so it's usually unnecessary to back up very far before that point to start telling the story. Now, that doesn't mean you can't tell what happened before. You can tell something that happened to someone when they were 4 years old, even if the story is taking place when they're 18. But you don't have to start when they're 4 years old. They can remember that that happened when they were 4.
Flashbacks.
Somebody can talk about it. So Harry Potter is, I think, about the longest term you can really find a good excuse to stretch a story over, because it has a logical structure of 1 year's school year per volume. And that's a reasonable amount of time to stretch a story over.
And also throughout a very key period of development from about 11 to about 17. That's very much basically almost the complete age range that we are talking about in this class with young adult literature.
Right. So you wouldn't have wanted to start Harry Potter when he was a baby. Oh, wait, she did. But then the next chapter picks up at age 11, which is an appropriate time to start when you're telling a story about somebody who changed when they were 11.
Exactly. Which brings us to backstory, which is your next checkpoint. And here, this is your chance to introduce any sort of history that brought the character to this moment in time that you're telling them the story. So in Harry Potter, the backstory is, finding out that he was always sort of second class in the Dursley household, and finding out that he lives in the cupboard under the stairs, and details like that flesh out who he is today.
And if you think about the way that J.K. Rowling did that, she showed you all of that. She didn't tell you. And so there are a number of ways to convey backstory. You can convey it through the actual action, and you can just watch the characters and pick up what's going on from watching them. They can have conversations, and you can pick up a lot of backstory from what they talk about between each other. And since you can get into the protagonist's head, they can have memories, and they can remember what happened in the past to fill that in. The last resort should be flashbacks or exposition. Flashback is where the author just comes in and says, 20 years ago this happened. It's much better to slip it in there a little bit more subtly. And then exposition is the worst of all, which says, Harry Potter was a guy who lived in this neighborhood, and he had this really nasty family that lived with him. You don't want to tell your readers that. You need to show it to them.
Exactly. And then this is a chance for all of the action in the backstory to begin to give us a picture of the protagonist and what their flaw is, and maybe a few clues about where we're headed.
And goal.
End goal, certainly. I also like to take the opportunity, particularly if you're writing any kind of science fiction or fantasy, this is a great place to include world building, which is very important for your reader to understand the rules by which you're playing. So in Scott Westerfeld's Leviathan, the backstory is an opportunity to sort of quickly get an insight into the fact that in this universe, the Austrians have the mechanical clankers and the English are the Darwinists who have the air beasts. And that's something that if he failed to provide you with those details before Act 2, you would be utterly lost when all of a sudden this alternate sort of reality started playing out. Another series by Scott Westerfeld would be The Uglies, where he has to do a significant amount of world building in that backstory as well.
Exactly. There, the characters are living in a world where everyone can look perfect after a certain age, and the main character has the conflict as to whether she actually wants to be altered to look perfect.
Mm-hmm. And then finally, the last checkpoint in Act 1 is the trigger. And this is only a moment. It is a plot moment. It's usually an action event that happens to the character that is directly attacking the protagonist's flaw. And so this trigger is not a decision or action by the protagonist any means. It's something that happens to them. And sometimes I like to think of it as an opportunity for an epiphany that is ultimately failed, which we'll get into more in the next lesson when we talk about Act 2.
One of the most common mistakes that I see amongst beginning students just trying to work out these checkpoints is that they do try to use an action by the protagonist, himself or herself, as the trigger. But the protagonist won't be taking action at this point. Something will be happening to him or her that is going to cause emotion that immediately follows. The idea of an action or a decision contrary to their flaw is a particularly dangerous one to use here. Because, for example, if somebody has a lack of self-confidence, they shouldn't be taking any action at all around the trigger, because someone who lacks self-confidence is going to be essentially immobile as a result of the events that lead to the trigger. So it's very important that it's a sharp shock, But that doesn't mean that it is some major earth-shaking event.
Certainly
It
not
just
necessary.
needs to specifically attack the flaw. So even something such as getting a rejection letter or something in the mail would be sufficient to attack the flaw of someone who lacked self-worth, even if they hadn't been particularly heavily invested in being accepted for whatever that rejection letter was. It still illustrates their flaw, which is the thing we're really trying to accomplish at this point in the story.
In screenwriting, this is frequently referred to as a turning point, the first turning point in the story. So it is a shift in what's happening, where Act 1 is different and distinct from Act 2, which we're about to talk about. But this trigger moment represents that kind of tip over from like, we're done filling you in, we're about to kick off the protagonist's journey.
Good. So for this lesson's test drive, I would like you to think about your own idea for a piece of young adult fiction and to jot down the titles, hook, backstory, and trigger, and then develop a short description of each one of them. I'd like you to restrict it to one sentence per checkpoint. And the reason for keeping it brief is that later on we're going to do a scene outline for your entire 3-act structure. And that scene outline will consist of just short scene markers that are the name, just enough to remind you of what needs to happen in each scene. But there might be 200 scenes in a completed novel, maybe
Easily.
even more. And so there will be lots of those little markers that you'll jot down, and you won't be able to think of 200 of them right off the bat. You'll think of 50 of them or so. That's enough to get rolling. But they'll be distributed throughout the 3 acts, and they're going to be inserted amongst a lot of these checkpoint titles.
The one-sentence description of all of these checkpoints is sort of, I like to think of it as your scaffolding, and you're about to fill in a lot more details when we get to the scene outline. But this is just sort of your big framework so that you can see the shape of the novel that you're constructing.
Right. And so since essentially these sentences are going to go away and be replaced by all those little scene bullets, just a brief description is all that you need for right now. So go ahead and take a crack at that test drive, and then join us for the next lecture where we will look at Act 2. See you there.